All right, hello, and welcome to the second part of our evening. If you weren't here before, my name is Declan McGlynn, and this is part of a new monthly series we're doing here at Point Blank London in our new second facility. And if you guys want to take a look around, make sure you come back on Wednesdays at 5:30 and Saturdays at 12:30. You can book yourself in by talking to one of our course advisors who are hanging around. So go and speak to them afterwards if you have any questions about the courses too. And I'm super excited to be joined by Alex Banks today. We're going to take a look at his track Phosphorous, how it was made, how you work in Logic, and you've brought a little friend with you as well.
I have.
Yeah, give it up for Alex Banks. All right, so I just want to dive straight into the good stuff here.
Okay.
So this track, I mean, maybe you can tell us how this track started and how tracks start for you generally.
So this track was the last track that I wrote for my album Illuminate, which came out a couple of years ago on Monkeytown Records. And I kind of felt by the time I started writing this tune that I already had like a decent album's worth of stuff, more than an album's worth of stuff. I felt like I'd done the hard work. And writing this tune, I really wanted to make a kind of stripped back, straight up, no nonsense kind of dance floor banger. And I had a lot of fun making it with that attitude in mind, you know, just kind of try and keep it straight back, just get some energy in there. And I didn't really have any preconceived idea about what was going to go into the track apart from that, really. So yeah, I mean, getting straight into the techie stuff, the first thing that I did is start writing it. Using Native Instruments machine software, and I've got this machine microcontroller here. I mean, it's just so quick and easy. Open the machine up. There's loads of cool sounds in there. I've got quite a few of their libraries, and even if you end up manipulating them, turning into whatever you like, just to load something up and having a pad of stuff that you can hit. For me, that's just a really immediate, quick way to get working on a track. I started playing drums when I was a kid. I don't play a lot of real drums anymore, but I'm always tapping, I'm always hitting something, I've always got rhythms going on, so it feels like a very natural way of beginning a track to just like get something down really quick and get the ideas flowing. So yeah, I loaded up this kind of slightly garagey kind of kit. I'm just going to play a little bit of the beat in here. Where's my click? So it's just a little bit of the beat in there. Now, the first thing it might seem obvious to do is then quantize it. What I actually like to do, if I've got time, which I make sure I do working on my own sort of album tracks, try and get a bit of the groove going.
Sorry, can I just, your computer's gone, and you just need to change your system.
Okay.
So do you always send the MIDI from Logic into Machine instead of using Machine's built-in sequencer?
I do actually, yeah. They probably wouldn't like me saying that, but I mean,
tonight, it's fine.
I've seen people do amazing things with the Machine software, but for me, I've been learning Logic for so many years. For me, it seems much more natural to kind of use it as a sound module and use it as a drum pad, and using the MIDI mode on Machine, which you just shift into by Shift and F1 there, makes it into a MIDI controller and just using it as a sound module, and then I can use the MIDI editor within Logic, which I feel really comfortable using, and obviously for a sequencing point of view as well. I mean, I think it's great the way Machine's working. You can run your loops within inside it and so forth, which is good for sort of starting out with the sequence. But I don't know. I just kind of like to have the MIDI in front of me.
And is it always Machine sounds, or do you have your own catalog you've built up over the years?
I have not so much in Machine, but I use Battery as well, which we'll come on to in a minute for the next stage. Battery, it's kind of I've got a huge sample library of sounds which I picked up all over the place, and that will be my own sample library that I've kind of constructed. And it might be, as you're going to see later on, that the sounds that I started out with to begin the track don't even end up making it into the final tune, but to begin with in the initial project, it's just all about kind of getting the flow going and getting the ideas, and then working into the details afterwards. How are we doing there?
Is that too small for you? Let me open up Logic and let me know.
Okay.
It's going to be because it's quite small for the... right.
Yeah, that's pretty weird. I can work with that if we have to.
No, it's cool.
We have to. It's because it's in full screen.
Is that okay?
Oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
All right, nice one. So,
Cool, as we were saying.
yes.
So, okay, you can see there's the MIDI that I've just put in. Let's just turn the click off a minute. Oh, wait a bit quiet there. So maybe I'll take kind of one bit out of that. I mean, I might go for like a couple of minutes and just try and sit into the groove and go back and edit it. But let's just say for now I want to take that bit. So I can use that as my starting point. Let's get rid of that extra one there. Something I'll always do is quantize the first kick, because if you don't have at least one anchor point, then everything's going to get pretty confusing after that.
The groove is kind of out of context.
Yeah, exactly. So just zoom in a bit. We've got a double hit there, which we don't want. And what I might then do is sit there on a loop for a bit, and I've got these shortcuts set up, Alt and the forwards and backwards keys, and I'll just kind of really shift these little notes around by tiny increments. So that kick there, for example, let's move it a little bit earlier. Gives it like a real push feel because it's coming in slightly early. And again, like let's nudge it back a bit. This late, it's a really subtle thing. I know it's kind of hard to hear, but if you're doing that kind of across the project or across the notes, like I think it makes a real difference to kind of give it your own unique groove. Don't get it wrong, the inbuilt quantize is a great, just a really quick and easy way to get your beats sounding in time. And I know you can use the strength controls here and the swing to get it how you want, but personally I just love doing it like this. It's pretty time consuming, but the result that you get is very unique because you just made that quantize sort of from scratch. Not wanting to kind of get too into the details, just kind of bod down on this bit, but what you then want to do if you're going to create other MIDI parts and even warped audio parts throughout the track, obviously because you just created a quantize, you're going to then want to be able to quantize other parts to that. So going up here, so let's call this region like beat groove 1, and if we can go to the quantize settings here, you can see it's not quantized at the moment, and there's an option down here, make groove template, and if you then do that, you'll see there's one I did earlier where it's called beat groove template. And any other parts that you're working on, if you want to quantize something, say we've got a clap on the sort of upbeat here. If maybe one of your bassline parts is like, oh well, I need that to really link in with that clap, then you can just quantize that part or the whole thing or whatever, and you can get it locked in. Otherwise, you're going to get weird kind of, the transients aren't going to hit together. Like if you want your bass to be kicking with the drums, that's not going to work properly. So, so that was the kind of basic groove. Here's the ones that actually made it into the track. That was the starting point. I had it up nice and loud in the studio. Kind of thought, okay, that's cool. Let's get going with that. Opened up another instance of Machine, and basically just going through. Got the loop on, just like trying out different libraries. Any sound that I think sounds interesting, just like play around, hit some things down, get it down really quickly, just to get the idea flowing. As I say at this stage. And then when I think I've got something that I'm liking the sound of, then I bounce them into audio, which you can see down here. So all of these parts began as Machiner. Obviously, I can't really edit them in terms of pitch or stretch them out so much at this stage because I bounce them into audio. But it's quite useful to actually limit your options at this stage. If you leave everything like infinitely editable, then you never make any decisions and you never get any tracks finished. So. So all of these drum parts I've then got going down to this drum bus here. And as I say, I'm really not worrying about the mix at this stage. All I've got here is a 1176 style compressor. The Native Instruments one does a really good emulation of this. And Soundtoys Decapitator, which I use a lot, which is kind of valve and transistor style distortion. Just to kind of gel it all together, not really using any other EQ or compression particularly at this stage, just really interested in getting the idea going. So these are the actual MIDI samples. Let's mute that. So these parts here, I just want to quickly talk about them. This is where Ableton comes into my project. I'm using that in Rewire. this weird little part here. I'm just going to show you how I made that. Now, how do we do this? Okay, so there's my second desktop. So in my studio, I have two screens running. The second screen I'm using for kind of extra plugins, like maybe like SPL meters or kind of frequency analyzers. But I also use it for Ableton. Have that open in one screen and sometimes swap between them and using them for different things. So that little sound that you just heard there began life as just some random loop that I got from a sample pack that somebody gave me. Not particularly exciting and not something that you'd really hear being in the context of my track Phosphorous. But pitch it down. Let's see how many. Pitch it down 8 semitones, which is just really quick and easy to do in Ableton. I mean, you can do similar things in Logic, but I just find Ableton so much quicker for kind of stretching things out, changing the warp markers, repitching or whatever. So that's sounding kind of weird now. And then just go through and like chop out little bits that I like. So there's that little kind of conga hit, and then there's this big snare. Mix that in with the other beats. So I love taking these two different approaches to drum programming. The much more kind of methodical one where I've actually played in the ideas and I'm, as more of a musician, kind of getting the percussive stuff going. And then I love the randomness that comes from just getting like weird loops and samples that should never really fit in a track like this, warping them in Ableton and repitching them, and then just, sort of seeing how they come out, and you get that nice blend of like the punchiness and the sort of clean, very manageable sound from the native instrument samples, and then just the weird randomness of anything that you got from the outside world and dragged into your project.
And those samples from Ableton, they don't have your custom swing.
No, they are just exactly as they are, and then I can play around with them. And if I wanted to then apply the quantize, it's probably easier to actually do it within Logic. You can use the flex mode within Logic and then apply the quantize there. But I actually quite like them being a little bit wonky. If it's not going to be a kick or a snare, it doesn't matter too much if it's going to be a little bit off. So for example, this kind of weird hi-hat. Hang on a sec. You can hear that's like pushing and pulling all over the place. Hear it by itself and you kind of think, well, it's not really going to sound that great. But in the context of the track, it gives it that nice kind of unexpected swing. And if I was to try and program that by hand, like, I don't know, I don't think I'd come out with the same results, if I was to try and play this stuff in as it is. So they're basically my two approaches to drum programming. At this stage, I'm not worrying about the arrangement either. I've just got everything going in a big loop and just chucking ideas in, not worrying at all about structure or what I'm eventually going to do with them. Obviously, I need to keep in mind, they need to kind of fit together as some kind of cohesive track. But as I say, for the moment, I'm just getting the ideas down and having some fun with it. So that's the drums down. The next thing, I went over to my Roland Juno 106, which I bought kind of just before starting writing this album. Let's just have a little listen to the part.
Is that just straight up recording out of Juno, or has it been processed?
That is pretty much just straight up recording.
My Juno doesn't sound like that.
Really?
Yeah. Where did you get it?
I'll lend you mine sometime.
Yeah,
So I haven't brought the Juno with me today, but just kind of as a little bit of a kind of geeky thing while I was preparing this project, I was thinking, I wonder how I can recreate these sounds in the box and how close I can get them. And went on the Native Instruments forums and had a look around. And I found someone had made this available for free for Reactor 6, like a Juno emulator. So this is the soft synth that you're hearing now. I don't think it's quite got the warmth, but it's not far off. You know, if that's the kind of sound that you're going for, like that's actually really close. But yeah, I mean, this one reason. I mean, obviously, you know, we've got a similar sound in the box here, but there's something I love about the hardware is I've maybe just spent, you know, a while kind of on machine and like doing a bit of drum programming on the screen, and then I take myself away from the computer, sit in my synth, which, you know, was like one of my new toys at the time, and just start messing around. And really, that was just 2 chords. I can't actually remember what something like that, and like Over the Groove, it just sounded so fat and so full at the time. I was like, okay, so this is a good basis of the track. Just gave me a kind of just an idea of where it was going to go, I suppose. I mean, it sounds kind of weird, but you just get a couple of sounds in there, and suddenly you envisage what the rest of the track can sound like and what kind of things you want to add to it. And obviously using some sidechaining here. This is a technique, you know, people use it all over, like modern electronic music, but it's a nice way that you can play a really simple part and that maybe doesn't have any rhythmic information and make it sound a lot more interesting and give it a lot more groove. So you can hear that that's reacting to the kick. And what I'll then do is do a few takes of, I'll just put it on loop and just play around with the filter, play around with the LFO, rather than just leaving it to play in a straight line, which is going to be pretty boring. You know, you can just like slowly open up the filters, mess around with the LFO, maybe manipulate some of the other controls. And you know, it means that as the track develops, you can, you know, maybe work towards a build-up, opening up the filters, or like, you know, drop down the high frequencies and let some other parts come in, and just creates a more interesting part than just letting it play from start to finish. So moving on, one of the main elements, just occurs to me, I haven't actually played this track yet for everyone to hear. We kind of forgot to do that, didn't we? Let's come on to that a bit later. Yeah.
The big reveal.
The surprise. So one of the other main parts was this vocal. I'm just going to play a bit of that. So that started life as a track that myself and my friend Hannah recorded originally for a butter advert that was meant to be playing out in Germany. Occasionally I do other bits of production work for like advertising and publishing companies and so forth, and had to record this really cheesy song, nothing to do with electronic music whatsoever. It couldn't be further removed from, you know, the context that it's ended up in. But there was something about the way I produced her vocal that I really liked. It's kind of like quite a close vocal sound, and very sort of intimate. I've done some like stereo panning on it, done all the mix work to get it to sound really good, and you know, it's just sat there on my hard drive. So I went through, chopped it up, found any interesting little bits and pieces that I thought could be useful, and I mean, they make no sense whatsoever, like by themselves, but that's kind of the idea. I wasn't looking for, you know, a vocal part that was going to say any words and something. And the interesting thing is, actually, people talk to me about this track and be like, oh, what's she saying? And, you know, oh, is she saying this and is she saying that? It's like, no, she's saying something utterly different. But once you get the different syllables chopped up, you end up like accidentally kind of creating words that she never even said. I mean, when I played her the track, she's like, that's not me. It's like, it is. It's like, well, I didn't sing that. I was like, I know, but, you know, that's how it's turned out. So you can have loads of fun with this.
Do you use Logic to chop that up, or Ableton to chop it up? Or?
I think, I mean, I started making this about 3 years ago. I think I dropped it into Ableton, and another trick I like to use is like moving the kind of loop points around, and sometimes you get it where it starts in the middle of a loop and kind of bounces in a way that's unexpected, and you end up with like half of one word, half of another. You can then, if you like, render that as audio, bounce that into Logic, and you've already got something that's already had one stage of editing done to it, and then once you start playing around, it just becomes further and further removed from the original, and I think kind of more interesting results as well. So, I mean, have no idea like what I actually played there, but you can see from the MIDI parts, it's just like tiny little bits of each. Let's just see if I can. So you'll see on here the individual samples, and you can see down here the MIDI part. So you can see it's just triggering tiny little bits of each word. And you get kind of quite a cool little hook going on. So that was the kind of main hook of it, and then I'm using Sugarbyte's Tornado here, which is a plugin I also use quite a lot in my live sets. And really simple to use. You just you can load different effects from here into these modules. You get like loopers and stuff. But the most fun is where you kind of do them all at the same time. And so forth. Obviously, it's pretty uncontrollable, but I really like that aspect. It's as with the Juno that I was saying, recording live takes. Rather than program all the MIDI for that, I'll just hit record and either record it through the desk, or you can set it up on a bus within Logic to record internally. And the same applies for Logic. It's so easy to resample within the machine. And just hit record, turn the knobs, have some fun with it, and sort of see what comes out, and then go through and edit the parts. Same way as if you were editing a singer or another musician doing some kind of performance, you've got all your takes there, just like chop out the best bits that you like, compile them together, and you've got something that I think is much more live and much more interesting than if you to go through and like manually automate all the parts separately. So yeah, I mean, I've used again a bit of decapitator there, and again this 1176 style compression just to make it sound really upfront. But that's pretty much the only mixing I've done on it at this stage. So moving on, the Moog Voyager, which again I bought just before I started writing the album, just like decking my studio out with lots of new toys to play with, and I absolutely love this machine. I used it on probably 2 or 3 instances of every track on there in some way or another, and made this kind of fairly evil bassline sound. Which ended up being the main hook for the second section of the track. So I'm just gonna have a little play with some. And the thing I love about using hardware, I mean, you can maybe get similar results in the box, but again, it gets me away from the computer. It's just a really nice object to play with, and it feels very much like an instrument. And I personally much more enjoy programming sounds on this than I do in the box. Obviously, I mean, there's things like some of the native instruments, and you can do amazingly complicated sounds that you'd never be able to do on something like this. But in some ways, again, I actually quite like the limitations of it. So it's 3 oscillator sound. First one's pretty basic. That's I think an octave and a fifth above, and then this one's I think an octave and a minor third, and then a bit of noise mixed in as well. And then this cool feature that you've got on the Voyager where you can take the headphone output or a feed from the desk, put it into the external input, and then you can feed the distortion. And again, rather than like programming all the MIDI for that, I'll just hit record and let's do this. I'm not actually going to record this now. So I'm mixing in a bit of the LFO as well here, which is altering the cutoff. So you can then feed a bit more distortion in to like help with the build up. And so forth. So that's a lot of fun, believe me. When you're in the studio, you got it cranked up. It's like, yeah, you know, you're pulling some bass faces. It's a good job I'm producing by myself. So yeah, again, not using a lot of EQ or any other mixing effects at this point. Just kind of getting the ideas down, and then I use this. I think this was a guitar pedal that I used to make this delay, just to exaggerate some of the parts. And I've got that set up on the mixing desk, just kind of like every now and again sending something out. I'm just going to look at one more part that I made. There's this, again, this is where the Juno came in. This was to make a part pretty much to go with the Evil Voyager part that you just heard. And this is a sound I use quite a lot on the album. And again, I've recreated it here. I think it's just a sub-oscillator on the Juno, like really simple with a bit of release on it, and it's got this real nice kind of graininess to it. And something about it I just really liked. I use it on a track called Hush as well, which comes a couple of tracks after this on the album. So you can hear they're playing a similar sort of pattern. In fact, I'm just going to have a little look at one more part, because I think this is kind of interesting. So it's like an arpeggiated loop. This began life as a sample, again from a sample pack that someone gave me. I think I started in Ableton and like warped it a little bit, dropped it into the track. It's like, yeah, that's really cool. And then a little bit further down the line, realised that it was actually from quite a famous track. I don't think my publishers or label are going to be particularly happy about that. So I decided to recreate it. I didn't want to just get rid of it. So I used the Voyager to make a kind of vaguely similar arpeggiated pattern. Here I've used Reactor's Monarch to create a similar sort of thing. One moment. I'm just going to turn these effects off for the moment so you can hear how it started. So it's along a vaguely similar sort of lines. I mean, it's just a 16th pattern arpeggiated line, but it was doing a similar sort of thing. Then I simplified it a bit. And then I sent it out to the guitar delay pedal again, and just... So I had like similar sort of thing happening here. And then try and get it to have a similar character to the potentially illegal sample. Chopped out the bottom end off it. Added a bit of Sound Toys Echo Boy, which I use quite a lot. It's very analog sounding delay. This is Audio Damage AD Verb, which I use a lot as well. Give it a bit of space, and then this 1176 compressor again. It's quite a cool plugin, Isotope Vinyl, which is a free download, which is quite nice for kind of making things sound a little bit crusty and warped. Put the sidechain on. So if we now compare that back to the original, it's doing a really similar thing. So the reason I wanted to highlight that is, as I say, like using samples can be from all over the place, even if they're illegal, can be a really interesting way to get your creativity going. And then if it plays an important part of the track, I mean, for me, that's made me realize that, oh, in that build up there, it's really nice to have a little 16th pattern thing going on. So rather than be like, oh, well, what am I going to do? You've got to pay a fortune to clear the sample or take it out. You could then be like, oh, let's just do something a little bit similar. Or it might be that, you know, you started the track with a sample, whole kind of composition develops off the back of that, and then you end up taking the sample out because the other parts you created are much more interesting. So, you know, sampling is a little bit of a taboo, but I think used correctly, you know, you can either warp it to death so that it's turned into something completely different, or you can just, you know, use that as a building block to inspire your creativity. But it doesn't have to be like this bad thing that you know, you can't put in a track. So, so the next stage really is to make my project disappear. Okay. Once I kind of feel like I've got enough parts to make a whole track with in this loop, I'll then start spreading it out. I haven't actually got the arrangement here because, trust me, going through these project files is an absolute mess. Like I first opened it up, this project from like 3 years ago, it's like, what was I doing there? So I've simplified this quite a bit, but basically with the arrangement, I keep all of these parts here and then just like copy and paste them across across the page and just start to try and build some kind of arrangement. I must admit, I find it quite daunting being at this stage. I've got so many ideas that I'm really inspired by, I'm really happy with. It's like, well, which one do I start with? I just don't know. But I think, you know, any producer, you just have to get over that and just start with something and be like, okay, let's just do that for now. Doesn't have to be the permanent thing, you know, it's these little like psychological tricks, like just get going with it. And then, you know, maybe you find some really cool combination later on, or when you're looping this, you mute some parts and unmute some other ones, and you find that your lead part works really nice with just the bass line by itself. So maybe just like, you know, you keep that in mind and you make a section like that, like later on in the project. So I'll do the arrangement, do lots of automation, maybe bounce some stuff down, resample it and so forth. And then in order to mix, you know, by this point I've used up massive amounts of CPU in the project. I'll bounce everything out into audio, and I'm going to go into the other project now, and I'll start the mix session afresh with all my CPU available, just running audio channels, and to begin with, no MIDI. So I'm just going to open up the other project.
And that's in Logic, so you always mix in Logic?
Yes, yeah, I do. Okay, bear with us a moment. It's probably going to tell me there's some plugins missing. This was the interesting thing, transferring this from my studio computer onto here. You just realise how many random like little plugins that you use that you weren't even really aware of.
There you go, it worked.
Okay, so there's the mix project. So firstly, I'm just going to have a look. I'll start with the drums. That's always where the mix kind of begins and just like underpins everything. What I quite often realise at this stage of the mix is like maybe those drums that I did initially that sounded kind of cool and fat and punchy when I was working on it in the writing session. Maybe when I start to mix, I might realise that there's something lacking. So you know, maybe the kick I feel like hasn't got enough kind of. Oh, bear with us. There we go. This is probably going to get a bit louder out. Actually, I can tweak it on there. All right. Let's just see what we've got. So that was kind of the main kick, and then again, I'll add some samples using Native Instruments stuff, battery. I'll maybe think like, oh, there's not enough mid punch in this, or there's not enough high end. I mean, years ago, I kind of made the mistake of spending hours and hours trying to EQ that in and like trying to get frequencies out of a sound that aren't really there. And the results were never particularly great. And then you just realize, you know, stop being so precious about it. Let's layer some other sounds on top of it. And so, you know, a couple of kicks layered together. The same with the claps. Where are we? So we've got machine clap in here. Sort of layered up with some other claps, and then, as I say, like it almost becomes part of the EQing, like finding different ways to layer up the sounds. Maybe you find a lower clap that's got a little bit more low mid in it can be a more effective way than just trying to EQ it in. But so we've got all these drum parts, as you can see, there's loads of them, and I've got them going into this drum subgroup here. From there, I can then send all the drums to these extra buses that are all doing different things, and all of those are being fed into this master drum bus, which you can see down here. So let's just have a look at the different buses that I've got going on. This is Ohmforce Predatome, which I think was the first plugin I bought many years ago. obviously it's very quiet because I'm running it in parallel. I don't need a lot of that in the mix. I'm just kind of, feeding a little bit of it in, which can make a big difference when you're using parallel effects. So you can hear that's really crushing and crunching up the drums in a way that'd be pretty nasty if you did that on the whole mix, but just a little bit fed in can add a bit of crunch. This 1176 plugin again, like quite a heavy compression on it. Tiny bit of like short drum verb. Don't know if you can hear that. With a track like this, I wouldn't want long reverb patterns on the long reverb tails on the drums, because obviously that's going to start to get really muddy really quickly. So just a short little tail like that can kind of add a bit of space in the mix, but without getting too, without sort of obviously taking up too much space. And then this DBX style compressor here from Native Instruments, just on the kick and snare, which is adding like a really quite nasty sounding, like, short transient punch.
Just like the original?
Indeed, yes. I've never actually used the original, but I hear it's fairly faithful recreation. And then on the actual master drum bus here, using this Neve style EQ from Waves, which is a little bit high-end boosts. I've actually got a real one of these in my studio now, and just you can add quite a lot of top end, and it still sounds quite nice without getting too grimy. A sort of analog style channel here, which is emulating one of the old EMI desks, I believe, and a API 2500 emulator from Waves. And lastly, a bit of limiting on here, just catch the peaks.
So you're happy running limiters within the project, not just in the master?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a technique I got off Rezo, who's an old friend of mine that I know from, he went to Westminster Uni, I think he was in the year below me, and I watched one of his tutorials and actually pinched this technique off him. But before I started limiting things within the mix, or like groups within the mix, I was finding that whenever I put a mastering limiter on, my mix would change dramatically, because the limiter is having to catch all sorts of peaks. And it's having to work a lot harder, and so the balance between the elements that you've mixed are going to change quite a lot. By doing a subtle bit of limiting earlier on in the chain, means that you've got a lot more control over it. Once it's actually hitting the mastering limiter, the mastering limiter isn't having to work so hard. And in this particular case, for example, I'll have heard, like, let's just take this off a moment. Maybe I'll listen to that and I think, well, that's actually a little bit punchier than I'd want it to be. But when you put the limiter on, it's going to flatten off those peaks and you're going to lose some of that punch. So rather than having to have non-punchy drums in your mix, you can actually compensate for that by adding a bit more transient punch before the limiter with something like an API 2500 or the transient master from Native Instruments is quite a good one, or any number of compressors. You would actually make that sound slightly punchier than you would actually want it to be, and compensate for the fact that the limiter is then going to chop those peaks off. So rather than it having to hit a mastering limiter and it chopping those peaks and having no control over it, you've actually got more control over the sound earlier on in the mix. So hopefully when you send it off to be mastered, you've already kind of preempted the processes that are going to have to happen to it. So on that basis, towards the end of the mix, I actually use this PSP Xenon limiter, which isn't going to be on the final mix when I send it off to be mastering, but it just starts to give me an idea as to like how these sounds are going to react together when I send them off to be mastered. So that's the basic drum mix. Let's just have a quick look at what I did to the Voyager part to make that sound nice and dirty. Let's get my computer. All right. So obviously I had a really nice source material there, like coming from the Voyager, but then used quite a lot of EQ, cutting out the low mid, because there's actually another sub bass line that's going on underneath, and also like chopping out the sub from it, because I'm not going to want both of those running at the same time. Using a LA2A style compressor there just to sort of even it off a little bit. And a bit of decapitator here. Now what I've done is chopped off the low end from it. Used the mix blend here, so it's just half and half. And this means that I can really focus on adding distortion to the highs and the mids, but obviously using the mix there, I'm still letting the low end through, because I didn't really want to distort the whole thing. Obviously, if you start distorting bass, whilst it can sound great, it's going to start to sound pretty crunchy. You're going to lose some of the kind of depth, and that isn't really what I wanted to do here. So obviously, if you put that way up, it's too much, but just a subtle bit of it gives it a bit more drive. I've used the own force distortion again here on a bus to make it sound extra nasty on the last drop, and I've just automated that. You can see there it's just dropped down in volume, like earlier on in the track. It's just on the last drop. I wanted to have a bit more grit, and then that delay pattern there, and then this really cool sounding reverb from it's the Audio Damage AD verb again. Gave it this really like wide kind of metallic sound. And then lastly, in terms of the mix, just one more thing I kind of want to cover. Up here you can see my references. I'm just going to have to read them to different outputs. We're just using stereo here. What I would like to do to just get an idea of how my mix is comparing to other commercially available tracks and other tunes that I've been influenced by is I might just drop these into the project at the top, have them as a going out of a separate output on the mixer, and just every now and again do a little test, like flipping back to another track and hear what it sounds like. I'm going to have to just quickly turn off my mastering processing here because they're all going out the same bus. So this is Joy Orbison Hive Mingo, or however you pronounce it. You can hear it's got a similar sort of kick, similar sort of clap, and kind of a bit of a similar vibe going on to it. So, and I've heard that in a club and heard it sounded amazing. So that's a really good reference for me to kind of keep listening back and be like, all right, what is it about that track that sounds fatter than my track? And when you're doing a really quick test, like, just going to quickly put this limiter back on. I might listen through that and be like, okay, there's something about his kick, it's got a bit more high mid in it, okay, let's try EQing that, maybe there's a bit more compression, maybe the drums are a little bit snappier, maybe he's got a bit more sidechain, maybe his is much brighter. I mean, obviously, when your track's going to be mastered, they're going to brighten things anyway, but if you can get it as close as you want it to be in the mix without having to try too hard, then when you give it to the mastering engineer, they can really concentrate on embellishing your work and making it sound even better, rather than having to whack a load of high end on it just to try and get it into a comparable sort of ballpark. So yeah, I find that a really useful technique, and it also means, you know, even though I've got a nice studio with some nice monitors, I can never trust it entirely. So if you're comparing your track, if it's meant to be a dance floor tune and you know roughly sort of how you want it to sound, and you've heard other tracks similar sounding amazing in a club, then it's a really great idea to drop that into the mix and, as I say, just like do a quick A/B comparison, and it can be a good way to like refresh your ears and kind of, you know, help you develop your mix.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there you go.
Nice one. So we probably have time for one or two questions if anyone has any in the audience. Don't be shy. There we go. I knew that would work. I'll give you the microphone.
I just had a quick question talking about mixing and balancing out different sort of soundtracks and everything. How would you sort of give everyone an idea of how you balance out, for example, one synth and balancing out your drums? How do you be able to put them together without one being too loud of it?
I mean, sidechaining can really help. As I was explaining earlier, like with the Juno, for example, that technique I was using, that can be a really good way of, like, you know, having a really full sound against the drums and letting them kind of, you know, fight against each other. And I mean, fairly extensive EQing. I mean, I didn't really get to look into that too much, but say, let's see if I can find that Juno part. Okay, so that's the Juno part I was talking about that we saw earlier on. Where are we? Now, when I'm in the writing stage, as I say, I wasn't really doing a lot of EQing. I want it to sound kind of fat and full, but maybe when I get to this stage and I'm mixing, it's like actually like all that low mid, all that low end, that's really interfering with the drum. So chopping out a lot of the low mid and chopping out the sub on anything that doesn't need to have sub in it is a really good way of like cleaning up your mix. And the low mid thing, I mean, it felt so unintuitive when I started doing it because you're taking all the warmth and all the depth out of sounds that sound like lovely and rich and warm. But something you've got to realize is you can't have all these sounds with all these like full rich frequencies in it all working at the same time because they actually end up fighting against each other. And you can never hear any of them with the fullness and clarity. It just sounds muddy. So, you know, in this case, you just have like one thing that's going to be full and have lots of low mid hit, and then anything that isn't supposed to be occupying those frequencies, just cut it out. And maybe there'll be another part later in the track where you know, the part that you've just chopped all the bottom end out of is going to be soloed, and then you can just automate it really easy in Logic or Ableton to do to bring that depth back in. So when you hear that sound by itself, it sounds lovely and rich and full again, and then just take it all out again when the other parts come in.
Oh, we got one over here.
It's only a daft one, really, but we found out earlier that Prince's favourite day of the week to write on was Sunday. Do you have a preference for when you do your writing?
That's an interesting question. I quite like Sundays as well, actually. I think as it's that day where you're not really supposed to be doing anything productive, so it's kind of like, just kind of like, you know, I suppose it's like that thing where the old man would go down to his shed and like, you know, play around with his tools or whatever. You know, go to the studio, mess around with something, and I think some of the best ideas from my last album did actually come on a Sunday because I was just like messing around, and it's that psychological headspace of like, yeah, I'm in the studio, I should be working, but it's Sunday, so I'm just going to mess around with this weird synth for a while and see what comes out, and you might come out with some interesting results. But other than that, no, I don't really have a particular day.
And how's your process changed now? I mean, you said this was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So like, are you still working the same way? The tracks still begin the same way?
My setup has changed quite a lot, actually. Like, I'm working on a new album at the moment, which I kind of started around the beginning of the year, and hopefully should be out early next year. And before I started writing that album, I really wanted to change my setup quite a lot. I mean, I'm using Logic X now, which you can see. Most of the album's written on Logic 9. And totally changed the room around and ended up getting quite a lot more analog hardware in there. And digital hardware as well, in fact. My studio is now based around a 32-channel Allen Heath GSR desk, which got the sound card integrated, and basically expanded this idea of like an analog digital studio. I was having so much fun with the Voyager and with the Juno and a few other bits and pieces that I had that you know, I wanted to get some more hardware because buying those bits of kit had given me so much excitement at the start of this album. That whilst, you know, this is featured a lot on the new album as well, as have the other bits of kit, I just, you know, you're like a kid with some toys, like, right, I want some new stuff to play with. And I think it's important as an artist as well to feel like you're developing your sound and you're moving forward and you're not just repeating the same things. And having new equipment, having a much more hands-on outboard approach really helps with that. Changing the space helps a lot. Like I just basically took all my equipment out of the room, got loads of sound treatment in there, got a custom desk built, like changed it all about. So it felt like a completely different studio. And from a technical point of view, I mean, as I say, like you've seen me use lots of times here in the project, I can't find it at the moment, but like the 1176 style compressor, you know, I realized I'd used it on so many tracks. So I bought a classic Yuri 1178, which is basically a stereo version of the 1176. Like, I've used this plugin so many times, I'm going to buy the real thing. And same with the distortion. You can see I've used the Decapitator a lot. Whilst I still use that, the desk that I'm using now has got a stereo valve channel. So whereas I would have reached for a plugin before, I might run it through the valves. And also the API 2500, I bought a real one of those because like the punch and depth it brings, even the plugin like adds something amazing to the drums, and I've heard what the real one could do, so splashed out on one of those. So really it's the same techniques that I was using before, but kind of, you know, amplified. Like, I've got the real bits of kit, so that feels really exciting, and it does give something that I feel the plugins can't quite replicate. Even if, you know, from an end user point of view, you can't even hear the difference. The psychology of being an artist in a studio with new equipment, and I mean, it doesn't even have to be, you know, like expensive analog gear, like getting new plugins. Like I've got the whole like new Reactor suite and plugins like Molecular, for example. I've used that quite a lot on the new album, and for a few other bits and pieces. It's just that thing of like keeping the studio fun and having new toys to play with, and switching up your processes, making you think in different ways, and that I think helps stop you making the same track over and over again, and exploring techniques to create new sounds that you haven't made before. And that's exciting for an artist, and I think it's much more exciting for the listener as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Good advice. So guys, if you like what you heard today, make sure you talk to our course advisors who are around somewhere about our range of courses you can learn about mixing, mastering, all that good stuff. But for now, give it up for Alex Banks.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.